Welcome to Business Legal Lifecycle TV, the live TV show all about the legal aspects of your business. We've designed this TV show to educate you in simple to understand plain English ways for complex legal terms, to help you understand why you undertake certain legal aspects of your business, and to help you develop a plan for the future success of your business. Did you know that any business owner is on average 7 months away from losing everything? And that is the average time that it takes for a successful business to fold when an aspect of their business is not set up correctly. Have you ever wanted to get legal advice but didn't understand what was going on? And do you feel like there's a divide between lawyers and their clients? If that's so, then this TV show is for you. We've designed the show to empower you and your business with the knowledge and tools to help ensure that those problems that so many businesses encounter don't happen to you. Business Legal Lifecycle TV delivers a twice-weekly show focusing on the legal aspects of your business. At lunchtime on Mondays, we present Fast Fix Monday, a quick 5 to 10 minute show to give you some actionable steps to consider for this week in your business. And at lunchtime on Wednesdays, we present our in-depth show. It's generally between 30 minutes to an hour to go through the complicated legal aspects of your business in a simple to understand and plain English way. That can be through educational pieces or interviews with experts in the fields. We welcome you to Business Legal Lifecycle TV, and here's our show.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this Wednesday edition of Business Legal Lifecycle TV, or if you're listening to on the podcast, welcome. My name is Jeremy Stratton, and with me today is...
Craig Mason. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us.
And today we're talking and continuing our discussion about Phase 7 of the Business Legal Lifecycle, which is expansion, franchising, and licensing. So I'm going to bring up a graphic for the people watching us on Facebook and the other channels. And if you're interested in the podcast and you're listening to this in the podcast and you want to hear or see the Business Legal Lifecycle, if you haven't seen it, check out our website, businesslegallifecycle.com or .com.au, and you'll see that Phase 7 is expansion, licensing, and franchising. So last week we dealt with expansion, and this week we're going to deal with franchising and licensing, because these are all methods to use when you want to expand your business. Now, the reason that we make this Phase 7 is that Phase 7 is all about when you've got a business that's in place properly. So, what do I mean by that? Well, you've been through the first 6 phases of the Business Legal Lifecycle. So you've been through the conception phase, you've set up all of that correctly, you've set up your structures right, you've leased your premises, you've got clients and you've got ways to engage those clients properly, you've brought on some employees. Now, again, you don't have to bring on employees, but a lot of people do, and if you're going to be expanding, you probably do need to bring on employees, as we talked about last week, so you need to have a think about that. And if you're in Phase 7 and you haven't put anything in place for your employment agreements or your employee policies, and it's something you need to think about again in this phase, as we talked about last week. If you wanted to check that out, last week's episode was all about expansion, so check that out on either Facebook or the podcast. Phase 5 is about protecting your intellectual property, and that's all about making sure that your trademarks and your systems are in place, and you'll see today why systems are so important for a business. That's something that Craig's going to talk about a bit later. So we'll talk about that. And then Phase 6, which is maximizing your business and bringing in investors. So basically, once all that's done, you've got a business that's really solid, that it can earn really good income, and then it's time to think about expansion now, and franchising and licensing. So expansion, franchising, and licensing isn't for everyone. There are many businesses that just want to have a lifestyle business where they work in the business from time to time. But if you want to do anything bigger with your business, then you need to have a look at these things. So as I said, we talked about expansion last week, and franchising and licensing are the other ways that you can look at expanding your business from a legal perspective. So that's what we're going to focus in on today. So the topics that we're going to cover today are what is franchising? We're going to have a talk about the time to franchise, which I'll go into a bit more detail about that. The franchising code of conduct, we'll have a chat about that. We'll have a chat about disclosure statements, because they're pretty important as part of the franchising code of conduct. We'll talk about franchisees and picking the right ones, the manual and what that actually means for your business, And then we're also going to talk about licensing and how that looks. So, Craig, did you want to add anything before we kick off?
No, I think let's start.
Excellent.
All right.
All right. So, I've moved across the slide for if you're watching this or listening to the podcast. Sorry, you can check it out on our Facebook page to see the pictures.
All right. So the slide is what is franchising. So franchising is where you have what's called a franchise agreement, and that's an agreement that is one person, which is the franchisor, grants another person, which is the franchisee, the right to carry on the business owned by the franchisor. And the whole point of a franchise is it's using the franchisor's system, marketing plan, those sorts of things that are determined by the franchisor or suggested by the franchisor, and then there's some control by the franchisor over the franchisee. So essentially, that means if you want to allow another business to operate your business, or want to control how they operate the business, then you could be looking at a franchise and setting up a franchise. So it's quite a broad sort of definition as to a franchise agreement. The law, looks at various things in regards to a franchise, and again, seeking the advice about setting one up is pretty important, and we'll go through that in some detail today. But it's not something that you want to sort of mess around with, and you've got to sort of go in with the full sort of idea about what you're dealing with. It's not something to be messed with, because the law does look at things that someone mightn't think is a franchise agreement. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in writing. You can have implied or verbal agreements, and the law looks at whether or not it is a franchise. And if there's someone trying to get around that and get around the law, then they can come down on them pretty heavily. So something you need to look at closely when you're looking at franchising. So that's what a franchise agreement, or what is franchising. And you would have, everyone knows about the McDonald's and those sort of franchises in the world. So that's what we're talking about. So yeah, I think that's probably covers that topic, Jeremy.
Yeah,
go on to the next
I think it's a great explanation and definition of what a franchise actually is. So the next slide is time to franchise. So basically here, as I said before, the time to franchise is in phase 7 of the business legal life cycle, of course. But it's also, you need to make sure that you've got all your systems and processes in place before that you actually do it. So Craig will go through that from a manual point of view. But the time to franchise in a broad sense is when you've got a business that you think is good and that someone else can pick up. Because a franchise is a model that you're selling someone the model of how to run a business. If they can't pick up a manual or pick up how they do the business and operate the business, then there's really no point in having a franchise. So the time to franchise is not now, depending on where your business is at. It's probably after a year or two of actually putting your systems and processes in place. Now, as I said before, franchising is not for everyone. Franchising is a hard slog. It's a whole separate business to what you actually have in place for your business. So, if you have a business, let's use McDonald's as an example. If McDonald's was, back in the days when Ray Kroc took it over, it was just a single business. It had one store, and he decided to expand that business by putting his systems in place. He couldn't have done that right at the beginning of his business. That would have been a complete disaster. He had to spend the time to get all the information and put it all together into a succinct way. So you need to be ready to be able to spend the time in the business, on the business of a franchise, because it is a separate business from what you're doing in the whatever your primary business is. So that would mean, as I said earlier, that you'd need to have some employees in place. You'll need to have other staff, contractors, to be able to help you operate your other business. You need to have all those things in place before you go for franchising, because if you don't, then you'll be trying to run two businesses. And we have lots of people that we've known in the past who have tried to franchise businesses, and they've tried to do it all themselves, and it's been a complete disaster while operating their other businesses. So make sure that you get advice. Make sure that you've put everything in place to sustain your business. And we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the different things that you have to consider, the different information that you have to give, and what that means from a business point of view. So Craig, anything else on that?
Yeah, I mean, as Jeremy said, it's something you need to look at carefully, and the timing of it all is important, because if you do, as you said, take your time away from your actual business to try to set up essentially what is another business, you don't want your other business to fail in the meantime, because then your franchise will go out the window as well. So definitely something you need to tread carefully, and the timing of it all is pretty important. And if you get the right advice and get all things in place, then the timing should be straightforward. So yeah, pretty important.
Sorry for that, Greg. Just had a frog in my throat.
That's right. All right. So moving on. So in Australia, there is what's called the Franchising Code of Conduct, and as the term describes, it's a code of the conduct that governs franchises. So I presume there's other sorts of codes or franchising legislation in other countries, because it has been something that's been exploited before. So they have a code of conduct that governs the parties, as legislators tend to do. And it's quite a lengthy set of regulations that deal with, what must be disclosed before they enter into the contract, as well as the ongoing business relationship between the franchisor and the franchisee. So pretty important. So it's beforehand and ongoing. So you need to be aware of it, not just at the beginning, you need to be aware of it throughout your franchise business as well. So it's not something you look at the beginning and then put in a drawer and never think about. The other thing is there are changes to the franchising code of conduct that happen, and some of those are retrospective as well, or have been in the past retrospective. So it's something you need to be up to date on in terms of changes to the code, because it might change your franchise agreement or the way you conduct yourself in the franchise. So pretty important to be aware of it all, and to have the right people in your team that can update you as things change, because retrospective legislation can catch out a lot of people. So that's the franchising code of conduct. Obviously, if you fail to comply with the conduct, then there are ramifications, as you'd expect. It could be that the franchisee could terminate the franchise agreement without penalty, or vice versa. There could be fines as well for franchisors for failing to comply with the code. The whole point of the code is that everyone's supposed to act in good faith. I think everyone appreciates as the franchisor comes into the agreement, I guess, with a power imbalance towards them, so they try to even that up with the code of conduct and make sure that the franchisor is doing everything in relation to the code. And then everyone's acting in what the law says is good faith. So, that's a common sense term, I guess. You go into it, in good faith rather than trying to stitch someone up. So it's all about, the whole point of it is that, and that's like what any good sort of contract should be. It's not one-sided. It's supposed to, basically govern the transaction, so everyone's got a bit of clarity about who's doing what and what needs to be done and those sorts of things. So pretty important to have a look at the franchise code of conduct before you go and franchise. So I think that's probably it for the franchising code of conduct. Right?
Yeah, and that leads nicely into the next topic, which is the disclosure statement. So if you've ever seen a franchise or been involved in a franchise, you'll know that the franchisor, so the owner of the franchise system, has to give a disclosure statement to the prospective franchisee before they enter into the franchise. Now, it's a prescribed form. So what do I mean by that? That's a nice legal term. But basically, the legislation prescribes and says that you've got to provide a disclosure statement in this format, and it's got to say these things in it. And you've got to address each of the questions that are in there and disclose things to you. Now, it's very tempting, I know, from a lot of business owners' point of views, to just do up the disclosure statement themselves. But that's really dangerous. Now, setting up a franchise isn't a cheap exercise, and there's a reason for that. Craig went through a basic overview of what's in the franchising code of conduct and the fact that changes regularly. It does, and that means that the law and the agreements and disclosure statements that you have to be updated regularly to make sure that they comply with the laws as they change. So the disclosure statement, whilst you could fill it out yourself, I would strongly recommend that you go and speak to your lawyer and get the the disclosure document drafted in a way that is accurate and doesn't breach the code. You are allowed to have minor discrepancies and minor changes. As with anything in the law, we are allowed to make mistakes, so long as they're not deliberate or deliberate and designed to cause loss, or so egregious that it would make the whole thing not binding. you are allowed to make small mistakes. So I thought today I'd just go through a bit of a list of the things that go into a disclosure statement, just so that the people who are watching this or listening to it can be aware of the kind of information that you need to give. So the first thing is the history of the franchise. So in any franchise, there's going to be a history of that franchise or the business. If there isn't, and you're looking at taking on a franchise, just to go the other side on the franchisee side for a second, you should be concerned. So you want to know the history of the franchise and also the history of the people behind the franchise. So everyone, anyone who's done a franchise should have been in business for a period of time and have some experience in how to run an actual franchise. So you want to see what their history is with actually running businesses. So having a look at that's very important, because at the end of the day, entering into a franchise is like any other sort of business relationship, except the fact that it ties you in very tightly with both parties. So you want to know what that history is. The second one is litigation history. So unfortunately, like anything, litigation is something that goes around a lot in business. And a lot of franchisors have been subject to litigation. There's nothing wrong with that. That's quite normal. Everyone from McDonald's through to your small coffee vans have been involved in litigation. But you want to see what that litigation history is and what it's about. If it's litigation where the franchisor wins and is shown to have done nothing wrong, then you can take a lot of comfort. If there's misrepresentations or if there's information that says that the franchisor hasn't provided the right information or has misled or hasn't done something that they had promised to, then you want to be concerned about that and probably have a chat to the franchisor about what they've done to rectify those problems. Because, as we've said many times in this TV show, the podcast, and in the articles that we've written, people do make mistakes. You're allowed to make mistakes so long as you learn from them and don't make them again. I think that's a fair comment, isn't it, Craig? That you can make a mistake and that doesn't mean that you're completely problematic, but you need to be able to fix those problems going forward. The next one that you want to make sure that you disclose, and that a lot of people don't, are commission payments. So what commissions are you getting for the franchisee's use of buying products? So one of the great things about a franchise from a franchisor's point of view is that you can actually make your franchisees buy products from you that you get from someone else. So if you're a McDonald's, and we'll just use that example, and I'll put a disclaimer here, I have no idea what commissions McDonald's gets on any of their franchises, but let's say that they get a commission based on the number of burger patties that they get from their supplier. They would have to disclose that in their franchise agreement to say that when the franchisee buys X number of burger patties, that the franchisor is getting paid X number of dollars in franchise payments, in commission payments, sorry. So that's a pretty important one. The next one that, again, a lot of franchisors get wrong are existing franchisees. So from a franchisee's point of view, if you're entering into an agreement with someone and it's a franchise that's been around for a number of years, you're going to want to know what that history is and how that history has worked with the different franchises. So in the franchise disclosure statement, there's a long list of franchisees who are current franchisees that have to be disclosed with their phone number and who they are, essentially. And the franchisee's got to have the ability to pick up the phone, call them and ask them how the business actually operates and whether or not you do the right thing as a franchisor. If you don't disclose all those people and there's a reason that you haven't disclosed them, then you're going to have a problem. So make sure that that all the existing franchisees are put in there. The next one is goods and services. So as I said before, one of the great things from a franchisor's point of view is that you can restrict where your franchisees actually buy their goods or where they get their services from. But you need to disclose that up front, because that's a crucial decision that a franchisee will make in their decision to actually go ahead with your franchise. So have a look at that. And if you are going to restrict where the goods and services come from, you need to disclose what that is, what that means for the franchisee, and all the rest of it. The next one, and probably the most crucial thing, is payments. So you need to disclose what payments the franchisee is going to have to make to you. So there are many different ways to be right in the payments that a franchisee can make to you. You can have royalty payments, you can have training payments, you can have commission on, as I said before, commission on other products that they've got to buy. But you have to disclose how those payments will be calculated and how the franchisee makes those payments to you. If you don't, then you're in trouble. And that's a very crucial thing, that it's very, very hard to say, oh, I forgot to include that training fee. but now I want to charge that to my franchisee. If you do that, then you're probably going to fall foul. So make sure that you disclose all your payments, and make sure that you have a look at the when you're setting up a franchise, that you have a look at the disclosure document and the franchising code to see what the standard fees are, because you may not realize that you can charge a training fee, for instance. You may not realize that you can charge a royalty fee as well as a franchise fee. There are many ways to do this, and but so long as you disclose them properly and the franchisee has the opportunity to factor that into their business plan, then you can put whatever fees are reasonable in there as payments. The next one is a marketing fund, and this is another area that a lot of franchisors don't do initially and then decide that it's a good idea. So a franchisor can set up a marketing fund, and in a marketing fund they can basically get all the franchisees to contribute funds, and then as a franchise they can expend that money out to pay for television advertising, radio advertising, Facebook advertising as a franchise group. You've got to disclose how that fund is calculated and how that fund is put together. Otherwise, you can really fall foul. And they brought in some rules recently to actually bring in ongoing audit requirements for franchisors, so that if you do have a marketing fund, if that's something that you want to set up, that you make sure that you get that marketing fund audited every year. The next one that's pretty crucial is the arrangements at the end of the franchise. So you need to disclose what happens at the end of the franchise. When someone enters into a franchise agreement with you, they're buying a business model for a period of time. So what happens at the end? If it's a physical shop, is that physical shop handed over to you? Are they to defit the whole thing and hand back all of the signs and all the paraphernalia that's got your marketing and your logos on it? All that kind of information needs to be disclosed at the beginning so that a franchisee knows what they're going to get themselves into at the end of the franchise. The next one is a cooling off period. So all franchisees in Australia, when they enter into it, have a 7-day cooling off period from when they receive this disclosure document. And if you and so they can terminate for any reason in that 7 days. If you don't disclose that you're going to charge a fee, if they do terminate on that 7 days, then you can't take a fee. So you need to disclose all that information and give them that provision. The next one, and really the last one that I want to talk about today, is provision of financial information. So especially where you're one of the conditions of your franchise is there to pay a royalty, you want to have the ability to go in as a franchisor and check out what their actual figures are. So go and have a look at the books and records of the company and work out what their turnover is, what profit they're making. So you want to make sure that there's provision that you can actually require them to disclose that information. In the disclosure statement, you have to disclose the fact that that's one of your requirements. If you don't, then you can't require that information. So make sure that you get there. So Craig, that was a bit of a long-winded one for me, but there is a lot of information there. But it's really important to have disclosure statements.
Absolutely. And you need to think about making representations as well, that you don't do them lightly. You're obviously disclosing a lot of information, but you don't want to make representations that aren't in your disclosure statement, for instance, verbally. Because one of the changes to the code of conduct was to prevent you being able to rely on the waiver of representations that are made to the franchisee. So you want to be really careful about what you're doing at this stage, because you don't want it to come back to bite you later on when someone tries to get out of a franchise. So be particularly careful about representations and those sorts of things. So yeah, that was one of the changes. But anyway, moving right along, sort of flowing from representations made by the franchisor, we're talking about franchisees. So with any business, and you treat your franchisees essentially as your customers or prospective customers, if they're prospective franchisees, and you don't just, well, you shouldn't just sell to everyone. It's very easy to say, okay, yep, sign on here, thank you very much, I'll take your fees, and here's your franchise. It's better to, a bit of a almost due diligence on them before you grant them the franchise agreement. So we think it's pretty important to look at your franchisees and don't just accept anyone, because if you do accept a particular person and it doesn't turn out for whatever reason and they leave or whatever it might be, that's actually damaging your brand, because you are the franchisor. So if someone sets up and then closes after 2 days or whatever it might be, then people say, oh, okay, well, McDonald's is closed. Oh, right. So they're thinking about your brand, not just the fact that it was someone that made their own decisions and were running a business, and for whatever reason it didn't work out. So you've got to think about who you're getting in as your franchisees, and it's a pretty important process. We know that McDonald's and those sort of bigger franchisors will go through a rigorous process before allowing a person to become a franchisee. There's lots of training, those sorts of things. So it's pretty important. I think a lot of people would miss this stage or address it, but not to a high level, because, as I said before, a lot of businesses want to sell to everyone, and that's everyone thinks like that because you want money, which is the whole point of business, or one-off. So selling to everyone is not a great idea in this sense, because you're handing over, not part of your business, but you're giving them your business model, and if they do something that you don't agree with, then it could damage yours. So, Jeremy, you wanted to talk about something from the case files about that?
Yeah, so I think it's really good to illustrate this in an example. So we have a client, and I'm not going to mention any names, obviously, but we have a client who set up a franchise probably about 15 years ago. And it was a franchise selling coffee in those vans that drive around to different offices and sell coffee to those people, and they're all franchises. And this gentleman set up a franchise system, and basically he trained all of these franchises up. So he had spent a long time building his business. He'd learned the whole trade of making coffee. I'm not a coffee drinker, but I'm told that it's very, very good coffee. And he started his own coffee van, drove it around his local area, and found it to be a really good business. So he'd seen social proof that his business was working. So he decided that he wanted to franchise that out. Now, what he decided to do, though, was rather than vetting his franchisees, he basically did an aggressive strategy for about 7 or 8 years of bringing in any franchisee that was interested in his business. So someone would be willing to stump up the franchise fee. They'd go through a day training, and they did a bit of training on the job training with them. And basically, he thought that was the right way to run a franchise. The problem was that everyone's not equal, and there are reasons that your big franchisors, as Craig said before, like your McDonald's, put the people through a rigorous process to make sure that they're the right franchisees. And the reason for that is that not everyone is cut out to be running their own business, and so not everyone's cut out to be doing this as a full-time job. Because essentially, when you're a franchisor and you bring in a franchisee, you are going into business with these people, so you've got to make sure that you can actually work with them. And as Craig said before, there are lots of rules about disclosures. There's lots of rules about misrepresentations. And it's amazing how when people fall out from a personal point of view, how there's lots of other problems that automatically come up, isn't there? that people don't that have never been mentioned before. So this guy brought in lots of people. He had, by the time he came to me, he had something like 50 franchisees around Australia selling this coffee. Very successful business. Because he had just gone with anyone and everyone, as I indicated before, he had franchisees who really couldn't run the business. And now in this kind of business, you need to be able to sell, 70 to 100 cups of coffee a day to make it. 70 makes a profit, makes it break even. 100 makes it profitable. If you're not cut out to do that, if you're not cut out to make good coffee, if you're not cut out to have the business relationships and the personal relationships with your customers, then it's not going to work. And unfortunately for him, when he came to me, he was having massive problems with a number of his franchisees because they weren't able to do the business. Now, we went through a very long process of examining his franchise structure. We re-examined his franchise. We re-examined his model of actually how does he put his franchisees into place. And lo and behold, when we put together a process of how to rigorously stop the people who aren't cut out for business going into his franchise model, he stopped losing people. He stopped having problems with people. His franchisees are so much better now because he's basically got the people in there to do the business, and his business is turning over a lot more money than it was in the past. So you need to be really careful on who your franchisees are and making sure that they're the right people, not only to run the business, but they're the right people to work with you in the business, and make sure that you're really careful about what you want to do. So that's a real life example that's happened over the last 6 or 7 years that shows that you really need to do that rigorous process. And success leaves clues, And the big franchisor firms like your McDonald's, as we said before, that's what they do, and that's why they're successful. So that's franchisees. That's all I had on that case study. Craig, did you want to add anything onto the end of that?
No, I don't think so. I think as Jeremy said, vet your franchisees if you're thinking about it, because they're basically part of your business once they're in. So pretty important to do that. So moving on, Jeremy, what are we on to next?
Manual.
Yes, so the manual. Now, sort of going back to what Jeremy was talking about, the timing of setting up a franchise, one of the important things is thinking about the manual. And a lot of people do a lot of other things about setting up a franchise and don't think about the manual. And the manual is going to be one of the most important things that you do when you're setting up the franchise, because that's the manual that the franchisee has that they follow to conduct the business as per your system, as per your process, as per how your business is run. So going back to phase 5, where we've spoken about systems and processes in your business, that is part of what forms the manual. So if you followed the life cycle and listened or watched any of the other episodes, you would have seen or heard us talk about the intellectual property and processes and those sorts of things, and that flows into the manual. And we shared, I think, previously a link, and we encourage everyone now when they're thinking about this to go to the link, and it's on the Business Legal Lifecycle website. And if you do /operations-manual, it's not the whole manual, obviously. What it is, it's the table of contents for the manual. And from that, you can look at it. And not every single one of those items in the table of contents is going to be relevant for everyone. But it gives you a starting point as to what you need to look at. And you can go through that and say, look, I don't have a process where I buy the chicken from, or whatever it might be. Then you need to have those sorts of things in your manual. And that's the starting point to look at that and to get those things in place. You might decide after doing all this that you don't want to do a franchise or something changes, but we see that putting those processes in place anyway is good for the business in any event, whether it be to set up a franchise, expand, or sell the business. If you've got all those sorts of processes in place, then the value of the business, in our view, will increase. So, it's not an easy task writing the manual. You want to seek advice during it, but you're not going to be able to get someone to write it for you you shouldn't get someone to write it for you, at least, because you're the one that's actually running your business. So you know your manual better than anyone else. It's just a matter of putting all that into a document that other people can follow, and it's not in your mind. So, manual, pretty big task, but probably one of the most important things you're going to do if you're going to franchise, I would have thought. Yeah,
absolutely. It's crucial. When people come to set up a franchise, the first thing I ask them is if they have a manual, and if they don't, I send them away to go and write it. And as you said, there are services out there that actually will write a manual for you, but I would strongly recommend everyone watching this or listening to this podcast not to do that. As Craig said, and what Craig said is very good advice. You know how to run your business, they don't. They can put together a manual and they charge good money for it. I've seen some that charge 30 or 40 grand. And at the end of the day, it's, in my view, a waste of money because they're not useful. A manual has to be written by the people in the business to make sure that they know what they're doing.
For sure. All right, so that's manual. Jeremy?
Yeah. So the last slide is licensing. And the reason to talk about licensing and the reason to talk about it here in today's show is all about what a licenses agreement is as opposed to a franchise agreement. So it's very tempting, and Craig alluded to it earlier when we were talking about what is franchising, to save a few dollars and set up a license agreement, because you don't have to comply with the franchising code of conduct. You don't have to comply with the disclosure statement, the ongoing requirements. However, people who try and do that always fall foul of the law at some point. Now, the reason for this is that a license agreement is essentially it licenses the use of your intellectual property to someone else. And we did talk about this briefly when we did phase 5 in protecting intellectual property back in, I think it was September that we did that, 2017. But a licensing agreement basically says, here's my brand, you can use that license or use that brand under this license for your business. If you want any sort of control over that brand, then a license is not for you. As soon as you start taking any sort of control, you fall into a franchise agreement. So Craig went through the definition of a franchise agreement before. It is very broad, and it's deliberately very broad because when they're writing the law, they recognise that tricky lawyers get in there and try and get around these things and try and get around the requirements. So a license agreement it can only give the right to use the intellectual property. You can't dictate anything. You can't dictate where the payments are going. You can't dictate how they use that brand. As soon as you start doing those things, you start falling into a franchise agreement. So it's very tempting because, as I said before, a license is a lot cheaper to set up than a franchise agreement, but that's because there's a lot less to it. So with a license, I think the best way is just to give a quick example here. And that's a client who, again, not naming any names, but a client who had set up a juice business. It's not a well-known one. I believe it's actually shut down now, but so you won't know it. But they wanted to set up a franchise, basically franchise model, but using license agreements. Now, they had started this juice business. They had a couple of locations. It was doing very well. They were turning over good money, and they were approached by a number of business owners who and people who worked in neighbouring businesses who wanted to actually set it up using their brand. They approached us. We talked about setting up a manual. They didn't like the idea of doing that work. They didn't like the idea of spending the money that it costs to set up a franchise agreement. We told them that they had to do a franchise agreement, and they were adamant they wanted to do a license agreement. I told them to go away and get advice, get a second opinion. Go and talk to another lawyer. Go and talk to your accountant. And quite luckily, I think for that franchise or that business owner, their accountant had actually been through acting for a business owner who had gone the license route and had fallen foul of the rules. Now, the reason that people fall foul of the rules is because they go and have a fight with one of their licensees, and the licensee goes and gets advice from a clever lawyer, and the clever lawyer looks at the documents and goes, that's actually a franchise. We can make their life very difficult by going and making a complaint that this is a franchise and they're trying to avoid the rules. And that's what happened to this accountant's client. The client had been railroaded. They had been basically shut down because they were trying to run a franchise through a license agreement, and the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, had shut down their business because they were in breach. They had 10 licensees, and all their hard work had been stopped. So in this case, the client was very lucky that they were able to stop that from occurring and to actually set up a franchise. And they did set up a franchise, and as I said, as I understand, I don't act for them anymore, but that business and the franchises had actually, they've agreed to part their ways. So, but at least they weren't going to fall into the trap of having a license and not a franchise anymore. So you can see that whilst it might seem good and all to save a bit of cash on the agreement, it can cause you a lot of heartache in the future. So making sure that you do it right is very important. So that's enough from me on licensing. Craig, did you want to add anything?
No, I think that summarises it pretty well, Jeremy. And I think you'll see from the theme of today's episode that there's a fair bit to franchising, and it's not to be taken lightly. And I know we harp on about it, and I know that I've said that we harp on about it, but seeking the advice, having a good team behind you, talking about these sorts of things before you do it, getting the manual in place and that stuff, before you go out and do a franchise, you're going to have a successful one, hopefully. But if you don't do all these sorts of things, then you could be in trouble. So again, seek the advice, talk to your team, bounce ideas, get everyone on the same page. Setting goals and those sorts of things are important here as well, obviously. And go from there, and hopefully you've got a successful franchise model. But I think that's probably it for us today.
Yeah, only just to add that, just to reiterate what Craig said, you don't know what you don't know, so get advice. And we're not trying to scare people with the examples, but this is real life. This is what happens on a day-to-day basis that we see. We could probably do a 10-hour show with examples on this stuff, and so we know what we're talking about. We've seen people get it wrong, and so we want to empower you to not make those mistakes. So you don't have to talk to us. You can talk to your lawyer, you can talk to another lawyer, get advice, make sure that you do it right.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. That's it for today. We'll be back on Monday for Fast Fix Monday, and we'll be talking about expansion within this phase some more about a different topic. So join us on Monday.
Thanks
See
very
you
much.
later.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Bye.